Siang sekarang ini sudah berkembang.
To be part of this conference. It's a pleasure to be here in this warm and beautiful country.
Known as a mega diversity country, we have 17,500 islands.
When the paper is accepted for publication, which now usually happens quickly.
And then this ties into the third part of the philosophy, which is this engagement idea.
Such as strong suppliers or even customers may force their interest into the business and ask them to adopt certain technologies.
And now the university complex is one of the most beautiful complex or campuses in the region.
The student will remember how you act rather than what you say. You have to become an actor rather than a lecturer.
The research funding from industry is somewhat limited, largely because an incubation center cannot be an episodical event.
Big applause.
of Financial Stability, Indonesia Deposit Insurance Corporation, Ministry of Research, Technology, and Higher Education, Fordham University, Bank of Finland, University Delimosh, Universitas Putra Malaysia, University Sarawak Malaysia, Society for Study of Emerging Market, Islamic Economic Business Faculty Raden Fatah Islamic State University, Palembang, Faculty of Economic and Business Syarif Hidayatullah Islamic State University, Jakarta, and last but not least, Center for Governance, Banking and Finance, Faculty of Economic and Business, Universitas 11 Maret. So welcome to Bali, and good morning, our warm welcome to the Honorable Mr. Ali Setiawan, Managing Director, Head of Global Market, HSS, HSBC Indonesia. Ms. Nuni Setioko, Senior Vice President and Head of Corporate Sustainability, SHBC Indonesia. Wahdi Salasi April Yudi, PhD, Director of Sampurna University. Dr. Chandra Alamsyah, the Dean of Faculty of Business, Sampurna University. Dr. Wahyu Sudarmono, SHBC Putra Sampurna Foundation Project Manager and Head of Management Department, Faculty of Business, University of Sampurna. And also Dr. Halim Alamsyah, the Chairman of Indonesia Deposit Insurance Corporation. And our Vice Rector, Professor Sutarno, the Vice Rector of the Academic Affairs. He is on the way here. And the representative of the Ministry of Research, Technology and Higher Education, Mrs. Dani Kwardani, the Dean of our Faculty of Economic and Business, Dr. Hunik Sri Runing Sawatri, and also all honorable invited speakers. So welcome to Bali. I'm Dewanti Chainingsi, and it would be a great honor for me to be your master ceremony of today. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, let us proceed to the next agenda. We would like to invite Professor Iftikhar Hasan, Managing Editor of Journal of Financial Stability, to kindly proceed to the stage to deliver the welcome greet. So, time is yours.
Thank you. Good morning again, sorry. My job is to welcome you. I wanted to give my regards to the rector and the vice rector of the Universitas 11 Maret. I think the upper administration is on its way, the dean is here, and all the organizers of this conference, and also Mr. Ali Setiawan, the Managing Director of HSBC, who is here with us, and Dr. Halim Alamsyah, the IDIC Chairman. I wanted to welcome all of you, and I wanted to start by simply saying that Universitas 11 Maret has taken a significant step in internationalizing this university in 3 to 5 years ago. And today I am glad to see that they are continuing in that effort, and it has been significantly helped by universities like University of Limoges in France, where Professor Amin Tarazi has taken a significant step. And you can see today the people who are here, individuals like Professor Rene Adams, a renowned scholar both in finance and economics, Professor Kos John, who are our two keynote speakers. The other keynote speaker we have is my good friend Ali Kutan, is coming all the way from Illinois. And Professor Harmant Marchant is coming from Florida. Dr. O is here from KAIST, and Dr. Politsidis from University of New South Wales. And these sort of individuals are attracted to come here because they are also committed to this university's international effort. And I looked at the program, combined together, they have really put together a significant and a very vast area of finance, banking, and even the new frontiers of finance and economics they have brought in. So I give a lot of credit to the organizing committee, the dean, and the Irwan and others who are involved in it. And so we're looking forward for the next 3 days of significant academic exchange. I am simply a friend of this university. It is my privilege to be a friend of this university and be part of their growing effort to become a significant academic institutions, not only in Indonesia, but also in the region and beyond. So without further comment, I wanted to again welcome all of you, all the participants who have come here from across Indonesia and in different continents. It is my pleasure on behalf of everyone, both from the organizers as well from outsiders as I am. I wanted to welcome you to this conference. Welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. And we really hope that you enjoy our conference today. We will have a 3 days conference, and for our first day conference, we would have a very great opportunity to hear the plenary session. The first keynote speaker will be delivered by Dr. Halim Alamsyah as a chairman of Indonesian Deposit Insurance. He's got his master in the economic development from the Boston University and got the doctoral from the Universitas Indonesia. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Halim Alamsyah.
Also very interesting seminar, and in this very beautiful island of God. I hope that especially for you who come from abroad, maybe this is not your first time, but I think this is the best time to visit Bali, during July and August especially, because you can stay. Very unfortunate for us, we have to sit here when the weather is so nice. In fact, actually I would like to hear the whole seminar by only sitting on the beach rather than in this room. Once again, thank you very much for having me here. I'm from Lembaga Penjamin Simpanan. This is the Indonesian word, but this is the Indonesian Deposit Insurance Corporations. Maybe for Indonesian people, the word corporation may be somewhat misleading, because this is actually a governmental body. This is an authority in insurance, of deposit insurance as well as resolution. So without further ado, I would like to give my presentation on Indonesian experiences in maintaining financial stability. Maybe some of you have already heard about Indonesian experience in dealing with this kind of financial crisis. And to make it as a background, as you know, in 97-98, Indonesia has been dealing with a very large, very especially tremendous crisis, and it changed everything in Indonesia. But unfortunately, the next 10 years, 2008, we have to face the global financial crisis. So I would like to, start my presentation on this particular era, 2008 and beyond. I will explain the macroeconomic environment of Indonesian economy just to give you the context and a brief background what happened at that time, and then before going into details, what kind of actions and policy options that Indonesia has taken at the time. Let me go directly to the first slide of presentation. Mind you that I'm trying to give you the balance between macro perspective as well as micro perspective, because this is what is going on in Indonesia at the time. This is the outline, and I would like to go further because I know that I don't have enough, not much time. Before the global financial crisis in 2008, the macroeconomic condition of Indonesia remained benign. Maybe for Indonesians still remember, the GDP growth still recorded around 5 to 6% per annum. Inflation is maintained at around 6 to 7%, while fiscal deficit is manageable, as always been the case for the last 30 years at a time in Indonesian context, while the current account recorded a surplus. So, because the exports are still surpassing the imports due to depressed domestic demand since the Asian financial crisis in 1997-98. This actually, at the time, making Indonesia a net capital exporter during this period. When the crisis broke in US, suddenly the financial market jolted very dramatic, and I think Indonesia is also felt the impact. The stock market of our capital market fell by half, and the government bond yield at the time shot up almost 80%. And our foreign exchange reserves fell due to central bank efforts to stabilize the exchange rates, and the exchange rate has fallen by more than 30%. And large capital outflows took place, and the central bank spent more than 9 to 10 billion US dollar at a time to stabilize the exchange rate. So these are the macroeconomic setting. And then in the banking side, while the financial sector is under pressure, we developed what we call it Banking Stability Index. And this Banking Stability Index is accelerating toward the red zone. When this index goes to the red zone, it means that it is already in a crisis situation. And it is driven mostly by the turbulence in the interbank money market. The interbank money market has stopped their lending activities. Each bank at a time only want to do business with their closely known counterparts, as you may also aware. And of course, this is a very dangerous situation. And when the banks are getting illiquid, as we all know, that situation is a prelude toward public panic and bank runs. At the time, there was already a growing rumor that some banks may have been in trouble. And in fact, there are so many analyses at the time, and some of the analysts should be reminded by the police at the time not to really, make some irresponsible analysis. Given the situation and the painful memory 10 years before, the government of Indonesia and Bank Indonesia, as the central bank, have taken preemptive policy responses to maintain public confidence, stabilize the rupiah, and increase the availability of liquidity, especially in the banking sector. The Indonesian government has provided at least 15 trillion alone, so at the time with the exchange rate about 1.5 billion through 3 state-owned banks. Just a precautionary move to boost banks' liquidity position. And during this period, the neighboring countries such as Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc., have taken some policy responses. They took the so-called blanket guarantee. So all deposits in the banking sector being guaranteed. During the time, Indonesia is also discussing the possibility to take the blanket guarantee. However, the traumatic experiences with this blanket guarantee scheme before has made that Indonesia is more cautious. So together with Thailand and Australia at the time, Indonesia increased the maximum insured deposits. So in our case, maximum insured deposit have been increased from around 10,000 US dollar to around 200,000 US dollar. So it is equivalent to 2 billion rupiah under the current nominal amount. And in fact, the government of Indonesia at the time issues 3 emergency law, the so-called Perpu, without the need to go to the parliament first. So in Indonesian context, Indonesian government can issue an emergency law as an indication the seriousness of the situation at the time. With all these policy responses, the economy as a whole managed to escape from the global financial crisis relatively well. The quarterly GDP growth did have a dip in the last quarter of 2008 and also early 2009, before recovering back to around 5% at the end of 2009. Inflation and fiscal deficits are under control. In fact, post-2008 crisis, partly attracted by the stability of Indonesian economy and partly by attractive yields on Indonesian financial assets, Indonesia saw a surge in capital inflows, thereby increasing the reserves, or the foreign reserves, significantly since 2009, sorry. The same also true in the banking sector in general. Banks did suffer in 2008 in terms of a decline in their profitability. You may see that in the table that I presented here. Some losses made their capital adequacy ratio, so the capital adequacy ratio also declined. But since 2008, their profitability recovered. Asset quality improved and capital adequacy position is increasing, and even until today, with the capital adequacy ratio above to 23%. Ladies and gentlemen, now let me talk about our experience in dealing with the bank resolution action during 2008-2009. This is what I call the microeconomic perspective. I still remember because I was still in the Center Bank, and I'm one of the actor dealing with this so-called Bank Senturi case, which was very tumultuous period for Indonesia, and the repercussion of this still can be felt even until today. As I explained earlier, in macroeconomic terms, the Indonesian economy is not really in bad shape. And the banking industry, in the aftermath of Asian crisis in 97-98, has emerged stronger actually, with better capital adequacy, manageable bad loans, profitable and liquid. This, from macroeconomic perspective, Indonesia is able to weather the global financial crisis rather well. Unfortunately, from a microprudential perspective, among the 120 banks at the time, there were some medium and smaller banks that are not in good conditions. So this is the so-called maybe the original sins of the bank. So when the pressure market built up, these vulnerable banks got the hardest hit. And even the central bank say at the time, there were around 6 medium and smaller banks were not in a good financial performance. Rumors about banks failed to settle their payment settlement at the time was circling around, and one of the bank is the so-called Bank Senturi. Now let me explain to you what happens with the central bank, with the failure of Bank Senturi. This bank is actually a small and medium-sized bank. It has about 65,000 customers, and at least it has 30 branches with a total assets of around 11.8 trillion rupiah, or approximately about 1 billion rupiah, using the exchange rate at the time. The bank has a poor track record. It has bad performances, and this, when the crisis hit Indonesia, it has become the most vulnerable banks. By mid-November 2008, the bank has been in liquidity trouble. Several times, the bank breaks the reserve requirement regulation of the central bank, and finally, by November 20th, the bank was considered to be a failed bank, and Bank Indonesia reported it to the KSSK. This is the Financial Stability Committee. And during the discussion within the KSSK, it is considered to be that closing the bank may have some systemic impacts to the economy and, of course, to the financial sector as a whole. So the decision itself, at the time, was praised by financial circle, especially by bankers and financial analysts, but criticized by the politicians, as you know. And I think, maybe just to inform you, 2008 is the election year, because after that, 2009 will be the presidential election. So there are so many rumors about what's going on, why the government bailed out the bank at the time. And let me try giving you the schematic presentation of the handling of this bank century. The resolution of bank century begins when the bank has been considered as failed by the central bank. At the time, the supervision of the banks are still under the central bank, Bank Indonesia. The bank was considered failed and then reported to the KSSK, the FSSC, and then the FSSC decided to handle this over to LPS, to Indonesian Deposit Insurance Corporations. And LPS uses its own fund to inject capital to the banks, starting from as low as $46 million US dollar. So it is a quite rather small amount. Unfortunately, because the LPS at the time don't have enough resources to do the analysis, and with the deteriorating financial performance of the bank, finally, the LPS or IDIC has to inject a total amount of around 600 million US dollar. So more than 10 times of the initial capital injection to the bank century. At the end, LPS managed to sell the bank to a foreign company, and the name of the bank is now J Trust Bank, for about 4.5 trillion rupiah. This is about 3.5 the book value, this with a recovery rate of 54%. What has the IDIC done to rescue this bank at the time? There are a list that the LPS was doing, and it is ranging from changing the management of the banks, please the next slide, inject capitals, and monitors its performances. At first, it seems quite easy, but at the end, all the staff and the commissioners of the IDIC, LPS, have to put their attention to this bank. So even though this is a small bank, again, the bank has to be managed professionally by the professionals, but of course the LPS cannot just let it go by itself. This is a very elaborate, time-consuming, and also costly exercise to LPS, not to mention to the country as a whole at the time, because the case of Bank Century has become very well known politically and also legally. Ladies and gentlemen, so what are the lessons that we learned from this experience? First of all, at the time, it was quite clear, there was some confusion. Who will decide the status of the economy and the financial sector as a whole in crisis or in a normal situation? Also, we are not very clear how to do the proper analysis of include public confidence on the financial stability consideration. Who will determine that a bank is systemic or not? Secondly, there were no clear crisis management protocol, even though there are already at the time some MOUs, but still there is no clear role and responsibility of each member of Financial Stability Committee. LPS or IDIC itself has not enough resources to handle systemic financial crisis alone. And it should not also be left only to LPS, of course. LPS at the time doesn't have enough capacity to detect a financial crisis. Initially, Indonesian Deposit Insurance Corporation or IDIC is meant to be only a pay box function. That means when the bank fails, then it will be liquidated, and then the LPS will have to pay out the depositors' money. LPS has also done. The LPS doesn't have the mandate and the power to do what we call it early intervention of the bank. It means that before the bank being failed, then IDIC is better to have the power or to have the mandate to also examine the bank on the spot, for example, just to measure the depth of the problem. It also has a limited resolution options. We don't have, like what the FDIC in US, for example, to do the purchase and assumption, and as well as bridge bank, for example. And last but not least, we don't have really enough legal protection. And this is very important for doing the resolution in the banking side, because you are prone to be faced by a lot of legal problems. So what are the lessons learned? I think as an early I think it is quite clear that an early supervision action to resolve banking problem at a very early stage, or what we call it prompt corrective actions, will minimize the cost of the problem banks. And I explained earlier that it is more than tenfold from the initial cost when we are doing the bailout of Bank Century. Coordination among financial safety net members has to be strengthened, not only in crisis situation, but also in normal circumstances. IDIC should have access to bank financial data and other important information. IDIC should also be able to conduct early intervention to support resolution preparation in order to minimize the cost of resolution and the impact of bank failure on financial stability as well as to the economy as a whole. A list of systemic banks is ideally to be predetermined to minimize dispute upon bank failure. But causes of systemic crisis may also come from changing in public condition of the general stability and the safety of the banking system and the economy as a whole. And this is the very important and also very difficult part. And IDIC needs to enhance its capacity and capability in doing surveillance and stress testing. So, given the background, there are some new initiatives in crisis management protocol and bank resolution in Indonesia. To say the least, the government agreed to reintroduce a new financial safety net law in 2016. And currently, this law has become the basic tenets of crisis management protocol in Indonesia. There are more clear roles and responsibility of each member. We have a predetermined systemic or non-systemic banks, and it is based on bail-in principle, and in fact, it is not allowed to use the public money to save the bank. And more power to IDIC, especially as a resolution authority, and also in crisis situation, because IDIC will have to take care the restructuring of the banking sector. IDIC has also given early access to do due diligence and preparation for resolution options, and we also have to set up what we call it resolution funds when IDIC do some of the resolution authority. Based on the new law, IDIC has been given at least, as I told you earlier, 3 new roles and mandates. First, early intervention. Secondly, more option on bank resolution. And thirdly, we are mandated to do banking restructuring program when the situation is really needed to do some kind of restructuring. And at the same time, if we have no money, if the IDIC don't have enough resources, especially financial resources, then we have some option to mobilize some funds, either from the market or on our own. We can issue our own IOUs. And we can sell our bonds to the public as well as to the central bank under certain conditions. And as part of the crisis preparedness, we now in Indonesia, at least every year, we do what we call it national crisis simulations. This is the photos that we are doing it in the last quarter of last year. All the members of FSSC, the Minister of Finance, the Governor of Bank Indonesia, the Chairman of OJK, and the Chairman of LPS, IDIC, should be in place together in different rooms. We are doing some scenarios, and we are trying to test our management protocol, crisis management protocol. Ladies and gentlemen, before I end my presentation, currently Indonesian Deposit Insurance Corporation is also transforming itself to become a more, of course, you know, to enhance our technical capacity, governance, as well as corporate culture. And this is not really a very easy job, because we have to also provide not only the human capital, to increase human capital, but we also need to increase our funds if something happened in the banking system in Indonesia. We are helped by international consultants, and IDIC put high priority on enhancing our technical capacity in bank resolution options, such as purchase and assumption, as well as bridge bank. And we are doing many new initiatives to make sure that we are prepared when the crisis comes. And we don't know, of course, when it will come. But we do hope by the end, these are our internal targets. We would like to, aspire to become one of the best, at least in the region. We have a lot of experiences in handling the financial crisis, but as you know, no crisis will be the same. So at the end, of course, we have to prepare by ourselves and prepare for the best. Thank you very much for your attention. As a final remarks, I think there are 3 remarks that I would like to give you. Having adequate legal and regulatory framework, as well as setting the right policies, are of course critical in handling financial crisis, thereby maintaining financial stability. And during the normal situation, when you are so many years, for example, don't have turbulences or no financial crisis, it may, you maybe become complacent, and then to make sure that you are alert that you have to do some kind of financial crisis simulation. And this is very essential. And not only to building our confidence, but also to make sure that we are having a quite high trust among financial safety net members. And with current dynamics in global finance, preemptive actions are very critical in maintaining financial stability. We do hope, the current trade wars, the risk emanating from Donald Trump economic policy may not be, become a bad impact to Indonesian economy. But of course, we have to always prepare for the worst. Thank you very much for your attention, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much for Dr. Alamsyah. So thank you very much for Professor Iftikhar Hasan, Dr. Alamsyah, and also Professor Sutarno. May you have a group of picture for three of you. So thank you very much. And now we have to move the second keynote speech. I would like to invite to the stage to proceed to the stage to deliver the welcome greeting from our university. So please come to the stage.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. First and foremost, let's thank God, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, for His blessing, so that we are all able to join this international conference today in such a good health condition. On behalf of 11 Smart University, I would like to send my warmest regard to all attendants of this international conference, especially, I should name in this conference, Dr. Halim Alamsyah, Chairman of Indonesian Deposit Insurance Corporation. Thanks for your joining and supporting. Professor Iftikhar Hasan, the Chairman of Friend of UNS. Thanks for the support of this international conference. And also to the keynote speakers, Professor Coach John from Stern School, New York University. Thank you. Professor Rini Adam from University of New South Wales, Australia. Thank you. And also to the Prof. Ali Kutan from Southern Illinois, USA. Thank you for your support and joining in this international conference. On behalf of SMART University, I would like to also to welcome you all in this international conference held in Bali. I think that for the foreigner, Bali is much more famous than Indonesia. Some of them said like that. That welcome to Indonesia and welcome to Bali. Secondly, I would like to pass the apology of my rector. He actually would like to come and join in this international conference this morning. However, because he got another important meeting in Jakarta today, and he asked me as a vice director for academic affairs to give a short talk in this international conference. Ladies and gentlemen, the event like this, the international conference like this, is actually can be an opportune time for sharing any idea, sharing any current issues that happen in all over the world. So hopefully we can get benefit from this discussion or whatever happened in this international conference. Like what committee gave it to me, that the conference is aimed to at providing a forum for researchers and also and also for policymakers to exchange their views about issues related to business and economy, with particular emphasis on finance, banking, and also on financial stability, particularly with regard to the digitization as the major theme of the Industry 4.0, the issues of technological-based business innovation and sharing economy model that have moved into the focus of public attention. I believe that this conference provides many papers that would be useful in affecting public policy with respect to current issues in business and economy. Ladies and gentlemen, I, representing the university, aware that the conference is possible by support from some collaborating institutions. I therefore would like to thank our partners, which are HSBC, Sampurna University, Putra Sampurna Foundation, Indonesia Deposit Insurance Corporation, Fordham University, University of Limos, University Putra Malaysia, University Malaysia Sarawak, Bank of Finland, UAN Syarif Hidayatullah, UN Raden Fatah, and the Society for the Study of Emerging Markets. Our gratitude also goes to the journal's partner for supporting and making this conference more attractive and stronger. Ladies and gentlemen, I would also at a glance introducing my university, the hosting and organizing this international conference. My university is the SMART University, is located in a lovely small city in central of Java, one of the big islands in Indonesia. My university just found exactly 42 years ago, on 1976, currently having 10 schools or 10 faculties and 1 postgrad school. Right now it's having about 36,000 students and about 1,600 lecturers. My university is quite fast growing right now, and also in the faculty of economy and business. Currently, my university is awarded number 4, I mean Big 4 in Indonesia, according to for ICU, and also is awarded as at least belonging to top 10 universities in Indonesia, awarded by Ministry of Research and Technology last year. Yeah, why I said that, you know, in Indonesia is consisting, yeah, right now is at least 4,300 universities in this country. So there's a lot of universities in Indonesia. Yeah, and right now is hosting and organizing this international conference. I hope that you are all, the attendants of this seminar, could enjoy the 3 days international conference. And I should also thanks to all the participants, all the partners, and also speakers. And I hope that your coming to Bali Island this morning is worthwhile. Thank you very much for your attention and good morning. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
University. And let me read to you of some of his accomplishments. Question is the Charles William Gerstenberg Professor of Banking and Finance at Stern School of Business, New York University. He held a PhD from the University of Florida. He also taught at the University of Chicago, Columbia University, and Institut d'Études Politiques de Paris, Sciences Po. He has won several awards, including the Bittery March Fellowship in 1983, and he published over 103 research articles in major finance and economic journals. So, without further ado, please welcome Professor Kaustion to deliver the keynote speech for about 45 minutes, and we will have a question and answer for 15 minutes. So, please.
Time here. You know, for a keynote speech, you know, you always wonder what you should do, and what I wanted to do is to give some ideas and thoughts on something which cuts across different topics. So, you know, students, I deal a lot with PhD students. So students often ask me, you know, Professor John, what should we be working on, you know? So I give them the same advice that my advisors give me, which is, you know, it takes about as much time to work on, you know, papers that might not have a big impact. You know, it takes about as much time to also work on topics and papers which have a lot of impact. So you might as well work on the latter. This is true, so I give them the same advice. And then they ask me, you know, in the early part of your career, is it a safe thing to work on what you might think as high-impact papers? You know, so that is something which I hear a lot from PhD students and from junior faculty, because, you know, yes, you want to work on high-impact topics, but typically getting it through the journal process might be risky. It might, you know, there might be more uncertainty in working on high-impact problems. So, you know, so you get different types of advice on that. Some people wait till they're tenured. In the US, you know, tenure hurdle is a big hurdle. So some people wait, or at least they say they wait, until you're tenured to really work on high-impact problems. Now, then some students ask me, you know, do you get credit for coming up with high impact questions? You know, do you get credit for coming up with really creative, high impact problems to work on? So my answer to them is, well, probably the most important example of that is what I call Hilbert's problems. You know, George Hilbert, at the turn of the last century in Sorbonne, he proposed a list of 24 mathematical problems. You know, these are called Hilbert's problems, and you know, people have been working on these Hilbert's problems ever since 1900, and the important thing is that many of these problems are still not completely solved. Even when you get a partial solution, you know, you get a chair, you get big honors, or even if you have a conjecture about one of these problems, people talk about it forever like it's the biggest thing since sliced bread. So I'm not saying I'm going to propose those, but what I want to do, so what I want to do is to spend the next 40 minutes or so thinking about some of the problems that we encounter in finance and economics. And more importantly, I want to go through with you some sort of a process of brainstorming our way to some interesting problems. Okay, so this is what I want to do. I want to go through a process, a little bit of a systematic process, and I'm going to show you an example of working through the process. It's only an example, and of course each one of you might have your own ways of approaching it depending on your own work or the things you think about or areas that you like or areas that your colleagues like or co-authors like or friends like. So that's this is something specific to me. What I'm going to do is to go through this it's a systematic brainstorming process, you know, to go after some high impact problems in finance or economics. Now, when you think about high impact problems, the way I think of them, and this is what I tell my students, you know, some problems in any area, but in particular in economics or finance, I call them, these are problems in neon lights. In other words, everybody knows these are high impact problems, everybody knows these are problems to be solved, but they're difficult, they're out there, you don't have to go searching for them, everybody knows these are problems to be solved, foundational problems. So, you know, of course, examples would be, you know, portfolio diversification. You know, if you have risk, how do you constitute your portfolio? You know, that would be, at the early stages of finance, we knew these are problems to be solved, and of course, you know, Markowitz would get a Nobel Prize for attempting and solving that problem. Even though, I don't know, some of you know, when Markowitz came up for his thesis defense, people like Milton Friedman were on his committee. So Harry has told me this a couple of times. He used to be at Baruch College in New York, so I used to see him once in a while. So apparently at that time they did not want to give him, he had, you know, the famous diversification results were part of his thesis, and they did not want to give him a PhD in economics because Milton Friedman thought there was not sufficient economics in his thesis. He thought it was more operations research, you know. So he came not getting a PhD on a work for which he would get a Nobel Prize, you know, afterwards, of course. But anyway, so some of those problems are out there. Or the other example would be CAPM. You know, how would capital markets come up with asset pricing models in equilibrium. I mean, you know, so everybody knew those were the problems to be solved. Everybody tried, of course, you know, these are difficult problems and so on. Okay. Now, I'm not going there, or, you know, you don't need any help on it because we all know those are the problems to be solved. I want to go to a second class of problems. What I'm going to do, here is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take 4 different areas where I have some experience, I have done some work on it, or my students have done some work on it, or my friends have done some work on it, and I want to look at those areas, okay? So I'm going to, you'll see immediately on the next slide, I'm going to take each one of the area and think about it, and then I ask the question, okay, given these areas, what problems have already been done? You know, so many, of course, there is interesting and important work in these areas. That's why I picked them in the first place. So there are some work already in existence. And when you think about the work which is already there, I'm hoping you also think about gaps that are obvious to you. So once you start thinking about those, you say, you know, yeah, we've done this, that, and the other. It's all very interesting. But how about such and such and this and that, which has actually not been done? You know, and then you start asking, why is it not being done? Is it because we don't have the right data for it? Or is it because one piece of it is, there is no literature which helps you to close that gap? Or is it because it's not that interesting in the first place? That's why it hasn't been done. So in other words, we're going to do, this is the brainstorming part of it. We're going to do some brainstorming. And then my contention is that among the missing links, after you do a careful screening of the missing links, you know, you're going to eliminate the non-viable ones, and maybe what remains are high-impact problems that you know, either us or your colleagues or your students or your junior colleagues, somebody should be maybe work on them and generate high-impact papers. All right. So let me get to the exercise. As I said, this is only an example. Each one of you might, or your colleagues, might have other examples just like this. Okay. So the areas that I'm going to choose are, of course, areas which are you know, sort of mainstream areas in finance and economics, I think. And I chose them partly because they are broad, and I'm hoping I can get the interest of many of you, and partly because I think they are important. They are sort of building blocks in what we do. So the first, I'm going to talk about risk. Okay, risk. Risk is, of course, finance in many ways is the science of risk, and we're going to talk more about risk, but that is, risk is one part of a big swath of finance is risk. The other is governance. So, you know, a lot of us have done work on governance, corporate governance, you know, various types of governance, equity governance, debt governance. So that's a big part of what we do in corporate finance anyway. Then the third one is, I'm going to call it institutions. Now, institutions, there are many ways of doing it. I'm talking about legal institutions, financial institutions, many ways of thinking about institutions. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail because this detail is going to be important in this exercise. And the last one, the fourth one, is innovation. Okay? So what I'm going to do, take each one of them, imagine them to be in columns. Okay? Each one of them, think of them in columns, because in these columns you'll have the different facets of that topic. And then I'm going to go through the systematic exercise of what topics have already been done, what topics do have existing research that is important and interesting. So that's the first part of the process. Let me do that. Oh, sorry. So risk. Now risk, as you know, has many dimensions to it. One of the major accomplishments of finance is to think about how do you price multi-period risky cash flows of various structure, where the price that you're coming up with is the price that you obtain in equilibrium with multiple traders of differential risk aversion, temporal preferences, and things like that. So that's one of the biggest accomplishments of finance. So when you think about risk, you want to think about systematic risk, you think about unsystematic risk, pricing, tail risk, systemic risk, various types of risk. Okay, so when you think about risk, so when I think about risk, I'm going to think about a column of different aspects of risk. Now governance. Governance is a big topic in corporate finance. When you think about governance, at least I used to think about governance in terms of equity governance, you know. So in other words, managers don't quite do things which are good for the capital suppliers because there are agency problems, and governance is ways of ameliorating the agency problems. So in other words, part of governance is equity governance, which is aligning managers and, let's say, equity holders. But then, as the literature has developed, equity governance is only part of it. There is, you know, there are agency problems of debt, and then you think about debt governance, you know, covenants, debt process like bankruptcy process. You know, how do you deal with a breached debt contract? So there are aspects of debt governance. Stakeholder governance. Then you say, oh, it's not just the capital suppliers who are important. There are customers, laborers, workers, employees, CEOs, and all kinds of things. And then, of course, in many problems you have, you know, the way you think about governance is from society's point of view. You know? So in other words, you don't really just think about different stakeholders in a corporation, but at society at large. You know? So when you think about, for example, bank governance. So we had the speech on deposit insurance. You know? So there are, the objectives may not be private corporate objectives of claim holders. It might be objectives from that of a society at large. That's important. So when you think about issues of governance failures, you're really thinking about social objectives. So that's important. Now, you know, one of the things I have been getting into a lot, and what I do is, of course, different types of institutions. You know, institutions could be legal institutions, financial institutions, large banks. So one way to think about institutions is, again, in the context of agency problems. So you have one way to think about agency problems come from the fact that you don't have complete contracting. So in other words, even when you know the optimal solutions, you're not able to get there because it's not that easy to write a complete set of contracts and pin down the decision makers to those. Now, one one important segment of the literature in corporate finance is that, you know, instead of, so there is a lot of literature on, okay, so if you don't have a complete set of contracts, maybe you can write the best, second best contracts. So it doesn't solve all problems, but you can ameliorate the problems. But then, in many areas, the contracting is so incomplete, so inadequate, that you cannot really rely on the best, second best contracts. You may rely on what are institutions, you know. So that would be, you know, ways of doing things, ways how people have done, long-lived institutions, financial institutions, legal institutions, things like that, you know. And then, of course, related things, financial architecture. We hear a lot about financial architecture. When you talk about financial crisis, you're asking, you know, if you have large financial institutions in an economy, how should they be related to each other? Is it good to have them intensely related? Is it good to have them only mildly related? Is there an optimal degree of network connectivity among them? You know, these have become very important questions even before the financial crisis. Now, one of the things I have gotten into recently is, you know, things like culture, corporate culture, or, you know, maybe even broader culture, religiosity, corporate social responsibility. These are all institutions of various types. All right. And then another area which you hear a lot these days is innovation. Innovation is coming up with new ways of doing things, creativity. So this is now, again, this is a big area of research. People have used, traditionally people have used things like number of patents and citations to patents and so on as metrics of innovation. But people are not so sure. There is, people say, you know, we need to be innovative about actually studying innovation. So, okay, let me go fast now. So we're going to, remember, we're going to put them down as columns, and then we're going to find relationships in the literature. So let me do that. Now, I'm going to argue, by the time we're done with this exercise, one, we're going to find very interesting issues and topics on the interface of risk and governance. Okay, so there are unsolved problems relating risk and governance. And then, of course, governance and institutions. So, in fact, the law and finance literature, the way I look at it, is that we are going away from contracting failures and fixes to the contracting failures, and we are starting to look at different types of institutions which exist around the world, and then try to see which ones do better than others and so on. Now, another big area where I get into a lot of interesting topics is bank capital and capital regulation. You know, so bank capital is something, I know many of you have done work in this area, and capital regulation is a big topic. So that ties in our financial institutions and important aspect to those. So as you know, Basel and regulatory systems around the world spend a lot of time asking what is the right bank capital to have so that, you know, you have well-functioning, efficient banking. At the same time, you have enough stability in the economy. You know, so these are big issues. I'm going to argue that we don't really have solutions to them, even though there are lots of papers and a lot of people act like there are solutions to them. And another issue is capital regulation. You know, capital regulation, even though that is a centerpiece of bank regulation, I think there are legitimate questions to be asked whether capital regulation is in fact the best way of going about things. You know, we sort of, you know, sometimes if you look at it deeply, you think capital regulation is like a, you know, it's not, you wonder whether it's the most direct way of regulating banks, you know, and whether it would work in all situations where you're worried about systemic risk, where you're worried about, you know, system fragility and stuff like that, whether capital regulation is the right way to go. So I think there are lots of interesting high-impact problems in that interface. Then equity governance and debt governance. This is an interesting area because many things which are good to align managers and equity holders, you know, so that's a big area, as you know, corporate governance. You know, that may actually aggravate the problems between managers and debt holders. You know, there is gathering evidence that when you put up good governance, good equity governance, the same firm's debt is actually going to require higher yields, meaning when the equity governance is beefed up, the debt holders are getting actually more worried, not less, and that may actually make the yield on the debt, even optimally, the optimal amount of debt issued, the yield on it actually higher. So in other words, debt governance may be at cross purpose with equity governance. I think this is very important because, you know, there are, for example, think about the capital structure in banks. Think about capital structure in financial shadow banking institutions, you know. So as you know, in these institutions, the leverage is very, very high. So the leverage in banks, if you have 90% debt and 10% equity capital, that would be considered well-capitalized banks. Now, think of the corporate governance in banks. So corporate governance in banks, again, if you're thinking of it as equity governance, you're trying to align managers with equity holders. Now remember, equity holders in banks have only 10% of the claims. So you're trying to structure the governance in banks in order to align the managers with 10% of the claim holders. Clearly, that's missing something big because 80% or 90% of your claim holders are actually depositors and other kinds of debt holders. So in other words, when you're beefing up equity governance, you're really messing up your debt governance. Okay? So in other words, that comes into thinking about governance in banks, and also, of course, that also comes into thinking about what is the right capital structure for banks. Because, as you can see, these are interconnected problems. Okay, I'm going to have to go fast, I think. I'm going to do that. So, risk and governance. We all know risk and governance are intimately connected because Holmstrom told us already, 1979, that, you know, if risk wasn't there, then of course the agency problems are actually easily solvable. This is also true, by the way, in partial ownership agency problems. What am I thinking about? Remember, Jensen and Meckling told us, if you have partial ownership, the manager has only 10% equity ownership, there are agency problems which come about. It turns out, so we know this, I'm not going to repeat that for you, but it turns out this problem has an easy solution, and let me tell you what that solution is. This is interesting. it also accentuates the relationship between risk and governance. So if you have, let's say you need a company to start that, you need $10 million. Okay? So you need $10 million. And you have two clever people, entrepreneurs, who have $10 million, $5 million each. They come together to start the company. Now, here we have even here we have a partial ownership problem, because if you give these people half the equity in the firm, you have the Jensen and Meckling agency problems of equity. Okay? So instead of which, let's think about a clever solution. What we do is, you tell them, look, I'm going to divide up the states of the world. There is uncertainty, of course. I'm going to divide up the states of the world into 4 well-defined, observable, contractable states. Let's say you could do that. So then you have states A and B, states C and D. So you tell one of the partners, you know what, we're going to spin a die. If states A and B come, you are 100% owner in this firm. If states C and D come, you, the second partner, is 100% owner in the firm. So what we have done very cleverly, as it turns out, is that we have solved the partial ownership problem, even though in a fundamental way, each partner still owns only half the firm. Now here, it turns out, this would completely solve the problem, except you see the gap. Risk complicates it to make it totally impractical, because each partner is bearing incredible amount of unsystematic risk, so which makes it not workable. So this is something we have been researching. We know something about this, but the important ways in risk and governance interact is fascinating. So let me quickly go. I'm going to talk about quickly 3 papers I've done. Now, one thing I should tell you, there are lots of scholars here who have done all kinds of work. You might find you might not be cited here. That's not because I don't like your work. I'm not citing anybody who is not me. You know, that's a simple principle I follow in the interest of time. So I did some work with Bernie Young, who was a colleague of mine, he has been the dean at NUS for a long time. Some of you might know him. And Lubo Litau, who was a former student of mine. So we did a paper looking at the following question. Are managers likely to take the right kind of risk in a well-governed environment? So in other words, if you have a good, well-governed environment, are the managers going to be too conservative, or are they going to take the right kind of risks? And the punchline of the paper is this accountability that comes about when you're in a well-governed environment actually makes the managers take more of the positive NPV risks. That is, in a project. So in other words, people talk about human capital risk and things like that. That is, I'm not a diversified shareholder, so I might have a tendency to say, you know what, I'm not going to take these risks, even though I have a positive NPV project, because if the project fails, I look like I'm a loser manager. So this is something we went through carefully and so on. We show that it is not really earnings smoothing that is creating these results. That was one. And a third paper, this is with a former student of mine. The question we ask is, how about unsystematic risk? Okay, how about unsystematic risk? So what what we say in that paper is, you know, unsystematic risk is a classic case where the managers and the shareholders may disagree. Okay, intuitively, the idea is very simple. You see, when you have a lot of unsystematic risk, shareholders may say, you know, I'm not that worried about unsystematic risk because I can diversify that away, right, by definition. But the manager may say, you know, I still care about it because the manager may care about the total risk, systematic and unsystematic. So what we thought was, you know, if we look carefully, activities where there are unsystematic risk should be the situations where governance matters a lot. You know, if we had a way of categorizing good governance and bad governance, the value difference between good and bad governance should be most apparent in situations and activities where there is a lot of unsystematic risk. Simple idea, because managers and shareholders may disagree about non-priced or unsystematic risk. And we find actually fairly strong results. That is indeed the case. Then in the middle paper, we look at systematic risk and governance. Systematic risk and governance. So now this is at the time we wrote the paper, it was kind of interesting because in finance there is wisdom which says, you know, things like governance, things like bankruptcy, things like a labor strike, all of those should not contribute to systematic risk because these are firm-specific things, you know. So these are firm-specific things. A well-diversified shareholder should be able to diversify that away. And but if you look at Gomper's, Ishii, and Metric paper carefully, you know, what they find is well-governed firms have an abnormal return of, let's say, 9.2%. They looked at carefully year by year over the 90s, and one way to think about it is there is an abnormal return of about 9.2% annually. This is surprising because it's not that good governance should lead to abnormal returns, because good governance should be factored in the prices already, so it should not show any abnormal return. So what we argue in that paper is that it's really returns to a fifth factor of risk. It's really returns to risk. So we tie takeover risk, actually, it has a component of systematic risk. So now here is the so we are going through this exercise. So what are we doing? I have risk in many characteristics. I have governance of many characteristics. What I'm trying to ask is, have we looked at, you know, all interesting links tying risk on one side, governance on the other? So there are some links which are already established. It's not just my work. I have to go through everybody's work. But the issue is, are there still important gaps that are out there? And I do some theory and I do some empirical work. So what I'm going to argue is there are a number of gaps that exist out there. So let me quickly, I'm going to run out of time. Okay, I'm not going to go into any more detail of these papers. So what are the gaps? So for example, I told you earlier that one way to look at the law and governance literature, you know, law and governance literature, is to say that, of course, you're thinking about different types of governance, and you're also thinking about different institutional structures of governance. See? So I think of the law and finance literature as emphasizing in cross-country data, that's less important, it is cross-country data, but emphasizing different institutional structures that you see around the world. So they play a role in corporate governance. The ownership structure is very different. You know, there is more dispersed ownership in the Anglo-Saxon systems. The role played by banks in corporate governance is again quite different, depends on the laws in place. Now more and more we are looking at the financial architecture. That is, how are banks related to each other? And some people are using interesting network models in order to think about this issue. So I claim, so you know, we talk about corporate boards, we talk about large block holder monitoring, we talk about a limited governance role played by banks, and takeover discipline. So one of the things I've tried to think about is how come the role played by these governance mechanisms are quite different in different parts of the world. You know, in other words, characteristics of the economy seem to fashion how we should be putting together a blend of these different mechanisms in different economies. I think there is a number of things to be done empirically and theoretically in this area. Let me go quickly. Now, one set of issues, let me talk a little bit about financial architecture. So there is a very interesting literature. I'm reading it myself, or I came to think about it because I teach a PhD class in financial institutions. Actually, I should say Iftikhar Hassan was also part of it. I do it with Iftikhar and Tony Saunders. So we think about a number of papers which are on this issue. That is, what is the right financial system design look like? You know, for example, a nice paper by Asimolu and co-authors, and there are related papers. He's asking, if you have, let's say, 10 large banks, how much should they be connected with each other? How intensely should they be connected with each other? At least one of the papers in AER says, you know, if they're not connected at all, some amount of connection is diversifying. So in other words, you start creating links between them. So if one of the banks get hit, it turns out that some degree of connectedness is like a shock absorber. You know, that is, in a way, some of that risk is shared by the system. On the other hand, they show that, you know, using network theoretic model, if they are highly connected, if they're really intensely connected, then that connectivity becomes risk amplifying. That is, basically what happens is, whenever one of the components in the system gets hit, risk amplifies and propagates through the system. I think it's very interesting. A number of things to be done. This is just, I think, it's just the beginning stages of a literature. Okay. Bank capital. Now, how much time do I have? Let me see. Okay, thank you. Bank capital, this is something which has been studied a lot, and as you know, Basel I, Basel II, Basel III, regulators have been at it forever. Bank regulation has been with us from, you know, forever. Now, you know, if you look at this literature very carefully, the academic literature, surprisingly enough, we don't really have good models of optimal bank capital. Okay? There are papers, but I don't have time to go into the details. But it turns out it is an unresolved question. Okay? Which is a little bit shocking. You might ask me, then how come Basel is able to tell us exactly how much bank capital is the one to hold? Well, they're just telling you that. It is not based on any optimality models, you know. So they do that, and the way I think of it is, which makes sense, Basel has to regulate whether or not the academics are agreed on the right model. So what Basel does is, you know, he said, let's increase, we had a crisis, let's increase the required bank capital by 2%, and if they are systematically large institutions, let's have another 2.5%. And then if things don't go crazy wrong, you know, you tinker with it. So that has been, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not much. So that there are very interesting and big issues to be solved in the whole issue of bank capital, and also the question, is capital regulation the right way to regulate the banking sector? Okay? So my own incomplete understanding of it tells me, well, bank capital, it's easy to standardize capital regulation. You know, it's easy to standardize capital regulation, but that's not quite the same as saying it is the most efficient way of doing regulation, at least not in all aspects of it. Just to give you an example. So one of the issues, you know, during the financial crisis, there was a lot of soul searching on this issue. You know, how much bank capital is the right one? A lot of systems are experimenting with COCO bonds. These are bonds which would turn into equity in the bad states of the world. These are sort of convertible, but convertible in the bad states of the world. Now, if you think about it, on one hand, the social planner is telling the banking system to hold more equity, and the banks are saying, we don't want to do that. It's too expensive because you don't get the tax deductibility of debt. Now remember, the same social planner is giving banks the tax deductibility of debt. So in other words, on one hand, the social planner is telling the banking system to hold more equity. On the other hand, the social planner is giving tax deductibility for debt. So it's a little confusing, the whole area, but let me not linger on it. Let me go into the last topic. Yeah, there are some issues here. How do you do capital regulation to take care of systemic risk? And is capital regulation the best way to accomplish the goals? Okay, now let me talk a little bit about a very interesting literature which has come about, linking innovation and institutions. So this is now, you know, an exciting part of the literature, and the general pattern there is easy to tell. You ask whether certain types of institutions are good for innovation or bad for innovation. You know, that's a well-defined, important, interesting question to ask. You know, is unionized firms more likely to create innovations than non-unionized firms? Is a tough bankruptcy system more likely to promote innovation than an easier bankruptcy system? Maybe a bankruptcy system which is more reorganization friendly. You know, there are all kinds of papers which I think are interesting. I think though, once you start looking at, for example, one of the papers I've written recently is relating religiosity and the cost of capital. Okay, religiosity and the cost of capital. So religiosity is based on a survey. They are able to determine whether or not the counties in the US are religious or not. Okay? Now, what is religiosity for a company? If a company is headquartered in a religious county, yeah, that's what I'm calling religiosity, we are finding that the cost of borrowing, whether it's bank loans or whether it's public debt, the cost of debt is smaller for those companies. We are thinking about it more deeply. I think corporate culture is tied up with it. And also, there is now papers on religiosity and innovation, and all kinds of interesting things. Okay, I think I am going to wind down. So, so what we have done, I should say, I have a paper on Islamic microfinance institutions. So where the question is, I'm looking at the loan level, at the performance of these microfinance loans, and I'm finding that religiosity of the borrowers, as well as the product design of these microfinance loans. So apparently, the traditional microfinance loans are not compliant with Sharia law. So what they did, some of the entrepreneurial microfinance people did, is to design some products which are compliant with Sharia. And I'm finding very interesting performance behavior on these loans. Okay. Now, so I've gone through the exercise. So what you have to do, I've told you some of the links which exist in the literature and some of the problems we have already talked about. I highlighted some issues which I think there is room for more work. But I think there are some important missing links just among the 4 topics that I chose. As I told you at the beginning, these are 4 topics that are near to me, near to my heart. You have your own topics, and you should go through the same exercise with your colleagues, your students, and your own research network. Thank you.
Thank you very much for Professor Coach John for very Please introduce yourself and deliver your question.
Yes. My name is Filipus Argentano Guntur Surya Putra. I'm from Master of Accountancy Study Program, 11 Maret University. My question to Mr. John, financial technology has infiltrated our economic life, especially in banking sector. They trying to replace and enhance the usage of financial services provided by financial company. Their activities, same as banking institution, has threatened the financial sector. My question, what can we do to anticipate it as governance or central bank, bankers, economists, and businessmen? Thank you. What can we do to anticipate it as governance, bankers, economists, economic and businessmen.
So he asking about how should we do as a banking and as the part of economics regarding to the financial technology interruption in the banking and financial industry. In terms of the economic lives, I mean the economic system as the banker, as the central bank, as the economist, and also as the market doer.
Is to be very optimistic. You know, I usually am very optimistic. So if I was a decision maker, I would think, you know, good things are going to happen. There is a lot of innovation in all sectors of life. Economies are, you know, opening up, more opportunities everywhere. So the only thing I can tell you is that if I were in this country and if I was any one of those people, I would be very optimistic about, you know, whatever I read, I'm very optimistic about Indonesia. So all I can tell you is that I would be optimistic. Good things are going to happen. Be part of innovations. I believe, you know, Indonesia has good institutions, and the institutions are getting better, and institutions are a big part of growth, opportunities, and economic development. I know this is not a very good answer because your question is very deep and very broad. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the answer. So any other questions comes up? We will still have about 10 minutes, so please.
Anecdotes.
Thank you very much. My name is Panagiotis Politis from the University of Sydney. You talked in your speech about the link between financial architecture and financial fragility. Since we are in
what was the first? Financial fragility and?
Financial architecture.
Architecture, yeah.
So let's consider the concept and the framework of developing countries, of emerging economies. Based on your experience and on your view, what is the ideal architecture that minimizes financial fragility and the possibility of getting into a recession?
Very, very important question. So, you know, I think that is something that we don't understand it completely. We are studying it. You know, as I mentioned to you, there is a increasing literature on that topic. So, so this is the way I look at it. Given the increasing globalization, there is already a pressure to, in other words, you cannot avoid some amount of interlinkages between the financial institutions in your own country and the world at large. So there is some interlinks already happening. So one way to look at the problem is, given that, what is the right amount of interconnectedness in your own economy, given that there will be some global links which, for various reasons, I may not be able to avoid. You know? So some of the global links you need for growth, for access to finance, for you know, various global markets, taking advantage of global markets. So given that I cannot avoid them, what would be the right amount of interconnectedness that I'm going to have among, let's say, large banks, as an example, in my own economy. I think we are still studying that problem, but that's all I can say. I think it's an important problem. So that would be something for you to work on. It's a good research problem, which is not just any given economy. In a way, many economies have to deal with that problem. That is, they are exposed to global links. What is the right optimal amount of links they should have in your own economy? So there is a problem all of you can work on. I think it's an important problem right there. Thank you. Thank you, Penny Otis.
So we'll invite one more and last question, and please, the microphone would be delivered here.
There's a gentleman there.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Amit Mittal from India. And my question is, I think systematic risk is a very bad measure of interbanking risk. How do you think the...
Can I clarify something? You mean systemic risk or
No,
systematic risk?
I mean systematic risk.
Systematic risk. Okay.
So I wonder if interconnectedness can somehow increase the unsystematic risk, and how we can map the unsystematic or idiosyncratic risk of banks into the governance system.
Oh, so you want to have a financial architecture that increases the idiosyncratic risk of banks, but not the systematic risk of banks. That's interesting. You know, why do you, very interesting idea. Let me just say right at the outset that here is an open problem. That is, how do most of the attention has been on systemic risk and network architecture, right? That has been the current literature. Even that is incomplete, as I told Paniotis. But now you're asking, let's understand how does unsystematic risk and systematic risk is influenced by the financial architecture. I think that has not been done, so that would be interesting. Again, you may have to model not just the financial institutions, but also, key players in the rest of the system. And you may also have to model, things like money supply, macro aspects of the economy. So that would be an interesting question to think about. So I don't have an answer because the paper has not been written. But I think it would be something interesting to look at. Now tell me again why you want to increase idiosyncratic risk at the expense of systematic risk.
Well, because systematic risk is related to market beta per se, but governance systems, as you said, are more idiosyncratic and they respond to particular problems, and these are larger scale problems in which you need basically group work. You need Bank of New York to be thinking the same as JP Morgan at some point in time during the crisis stage, so that nobody is thinking of a credit bubble after.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, I think that was the last question of the keynote speech 2, and please, you have to remain to the stage, and let me invite the Dean of Faculty of Economic and Business, Dr. Hunix Runing Sawitri, to deliver a token of appreciation.
By the way, I want to thank you all for listening to me. And if you want to write me emails and things like that, I'm very happy to answer them. Thank you.
So give applause for Professor Coach John for the very interesting topics and discussion. So let's give an applause for Professor Koshon for delivering the keynote speech. So you may come down to your seat. Very nice. Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, this was the end of the first day of plenary session of today's conference. And I would like to thank you very much to all of you who attend this first day conference. And do not forget, we still have a day 2 and day 3 that will also have a very great session. We prepare a lot of a great speaker that we can see tomorrow. And I would like to remind you that after this, at 11 o'clock sharp, the plenary session of day 1 will be start. So prepare for your session. And if you want to take a look to the breakout room, our committee will available outside this gate, and you can ask them about the location. So once again, thank you very much for coming to the first day of plenary session, our SMICBES and SMARTFAB 2018. I'm Dewanti Chayaningsi. Thank you very much, and have.
Environment, quality of schools is not better than Indonesia.
When the government and the private sector are shifting.
You have akhlaq, the good moral character, behavior, and living harmoniously in a society. And after graduating from Fordham University, he had gone to Columbia University.
This is like preparing me the story of my life in academia, not the story of my other life.
100 scholars from all over the world. Not 5, not 3, 100.
Because we have to fulfill our duty, our responsibility.
congratulations to ONS.
Ilmu sosial sekarang ini sudah berkembang.
To be part of this conference. It's a pleasure to be here in this warm and beautiful country.
Known as a mega diversity country, we have 17,500 islands.
When the paper is accepted for publication, which now usually happens quickly.
And then this ties into the third part of the philosophy, which is this engagement idea.
Such as strong suppliers or even customers may force their interest into the business and ask them to adopt certain technologies.
And now the university complex is one of the most beautiful complex or campuses in the region.
The student will remember how you act rather than what you say. You have to become an actor rather than a lecturer.
The research funding from industry is somewhat limited, largely because an incubation center cannot be an episodical event.
Big applause.